In Africa, there has been a continuous debate on some people paying more taxes, and we're just going to have a conversation on how this has continued to deepen inequalities. Earlier in the morning, Ishmael Zulu, the policy officer at Tax and Equity at Tax Justice Network Africa, joined us on a look into the tax policy formulation process on the continent, with emphasis on whether the process takes into consideration any available research.
Tax Justice Network Africa, TJNA, recently carried out a study which is soon to be published that explores the role of civil society research evidence in influencing government policies towards fair tax system in Africa. And what we tried to achieve with this piece of research was to respond to two questions primarily. So the first one is, how have policymakers used research evidence in policymaking? And then secondly, what are the factors that influence the extent to which policymakers use research evidence that is generated by CSOs? And we have 4 country case studies that we looked at to respond to these two questions. So we looked at Nigeria in West Africa, Zambia in Southern Africa, Uganda in East Africa, and Tunisia in North Africa. And from the harmonized findings of the research paper, what we found is that there's a bias towards research evidence that proposes solutions, as opposed to research evidence that diagnoses the problem. Secondly, I think it was important the access and relationships with policymakers. So the closer you are to policymakers, the more likely you are to see an increased uptake in research evidence. And then lastly, and interestingly, there's a demand for new tax policies amongst policymakers. And this comes because of Africa's need to increase domestic resource mobilization now in the wake of the COVID-19 pandemic, when Africa saw its most recent recession in over 50 years as a continent. So the need and demand for new tax policies has actually increased with that.
Yeah, Ishmael, from what you're saying, it's clear that public attitude as well as perceptions have changed over time. But what does the tax data show about different aspects of sustainable development, such as inequality?
Yes, so inequality now is becoming a more topical issue. In the wake of the COVID-19, when you look at this from a global perspective, and the challenges that we've seen that have come in the wake of the COVID-19 pandemic, it's brought to wider consciousness the clear fault lines that exist and that are quickly rising in terms of economic inequalities in the world, and specifically on the African continent. So in Africa, the total number of extremely poor is expected to rise by to 514 million by the end of 2021, with about 40 million Africans being pushed into extreme poverty. And these statistics are quite worrying. And when you look at it through an inequality lens, while there's a lot of poor people that we're going to see based off of what I've just shared, when you look at it from the richest, about 0.0001% own over 40% of the wealth on the entire continent. So there's a clear contrast between the rich in Africa and the poor. And this is the importance of the conversation around taxation and the use of research evidence in fairness of taxation, because tax in itself is one of the most important tools because it's a sustainable source of revenue for any government to ensure that it caters for the basic needs of its citizen and to serve as an antidote to pre-existing economic inequality. So this is where African governments use taxation as a tool to tax those that are able to pay, those that are richer, and then use those resources to spread to those that are poor and provide the basic needs to the poor and those that are in poverty.
And now, just referring to the study, what would you say were the most interesting and new findings on how CSOs can use research evidence to even influence politics?
Yes, so interestingly, the study had quite a number of interesting findings. I'll summarize them in 6 brief points. So I think in ensuring the uptake of research evidence, what we found was useful was the targeting of specific individuals of policymakers with tailored information as part of an ongoing engagement. So this is where CSOs rather than, let's say, bringing together policymakers that have different interests, you target specific individuals that you know are interested in a specific piece of work. You provide them with information regarding that specific piece of work, and it should be an ongoing engagement rather than a once-off meeting or once-off engagement. Secondly, engage the policymakers early as opposed to when the research is coming to a conclusion. You're more likely to see an increased uptake of the research when you engage the policymakers early. The third point is that you create a non-partisan reputation as CSOs. When policymakers see you as politically affiliated, the likelihood of successful engagements with them is significantly minimized. Then the fourth point is to ensure research accessibility. It's important that when you produce research, it's easily accessible by the policymakers. Then the fifth point is to build internal capacity. Research can be very technically heavy, so it's important that you build capacity within the organization itself so that you're able to produce quality research and credible studies. Then lastly, I think, which is one of the most important points, is to enter the policymaking process strategically. You know, when you're engaging with policymakers, which talks about timing, it's critical that CSOs identify the appropriate timing and avenues through which to enter the dialogue.
Yeah, when you speak of actually coming up with a quality research and making sure that the results that are found actually mirror what is really happening down in the economies, data is crucial. But we also know here on the African continent that data is still an area that we're still lagging behind. So doesn't this pose a huge challenge?
Yes, and that speaks to now the credibility. It's important to know where you are sourcing your information. It's important to have credible sources of information, because that is one of the factors that actually influence the uptake of research evidence. From our findings in the study itself, policymakers see credibility as one of the most important aspects in terms of uptake or whether they adopt the recommendations that CSOs are proposing. We found that, interestingly, when you provide evidence based off of known sources such as the World Bank, the IMF, some of these international bodies, and then you localize that information to the country-specific data, there is increased uptake. So it's important, one, to have credible sources, but then like you're alluding to, the quality of information and knowing where to access information from. Once you know how to access information and then break down that data, you then see an increased uptake of the evidence that is produced by CSOs.
Yeah, and also before I let you go, just looking at the impact, value, and untapped potential of CSOs' use of research evidence, just to unpack for us this in a bit more.
Yeah, I think now more than ever for the African continent, when you look at the recession that we went through, the recession that I alluded to, that Africa's worst recession in over 50 years, it's important now that CSOs are producing quality information because this information has value in terms of Africa's road towards recovery. We know that Africa is headed towards recovery post-COVID-19. However, it's important that this recovery is informed. Decisions that are being made by policymakers are informed, and that you take cognizance of the challenges that we're going to face in our road towards recovery. We spoke earlier about inequality. It is important that governments are cognizant of the challenge that inequality poses, because heading towards recovery with a large group of people marginalized is not feasible. You can't achieve sustainable development like that. And now, hence, comes the importance of the value, the impact, and the potential of CSOs' research evidence. So one, it's important that CSOs are producing credible information. They're making sure that there's access to the information that they're producing. And then importantly also is that they're engaging and working closely with African governments in ensuring that the decisions that are being made post-COVID-19 as we head towards recovery are informed, and that we are not leaving groups of people behind through inequality.